Welcome back to the show. This is KDS Reviews. This is a special viewer request because, one of my subscribers out here in the real world was talking to me about, I wonder whatever happened to all these Saturday morning cartoon shows that used to come on, these Saturday morning programs. They just all disappeared. So I said, it'd be a good idea to make a little episode about this. I could talk all day long about shows like Hong Kong Phooey, Jabberjaw, Flintstones, and Scooby Doo. Let's talk about some of the different ones that were out there. Let's start off with one that everybody knows, and that's Super Friends. This was before the James Gunn, Zack Snyder confrontation. It was basically a poor man version of the Justice League. You had Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and such, fighting your villain of the week. This is actually, if you want to believe it, how I found out about the Joker. You know, it's actually went on for quite a number of years this show was on. And then they brought in these two brother-sister twins. They were called the Wonder Twins. Now, the crazy part is the girl, she was transformed into some kind of animal, a cat, a lion or a bird. And the little boy, he was turned into water for some reason. Every time, there was some kind of water that had to do with it. I don't know what that was supposed to be about. Up next, you got one here that you've probably seen off of Cartoon Network, and that's Space Ghost. He was just a basically poor man's version of Superman anyway. Him and his team would be fighting these aliens and all this other stuff would be going on. Matter of fact, he came about because of Superman. But soon after that, he was dumped for the Herculoids. Now, this one was kind of an interesting show here. This is another one. Has a little team of characters here fighting to keep the planet safe from invaders. It was actually, for that time period, late 70s, it was actually a pretty interesting little cartoon here, nothing great going on here. But it was still had some good action and fight and stories in it. Now, here's one right here that I bet hardly anybody remembers. It was called Tarzan. Now, this show was actually faithful to the Edgar Rice Burroughs books. They'd have stories on there about poachers, and then these guys would come in and try to kill these animals that was on the verge of extinction. This is actually a pretty good show, really. I really remember this because I was like, wow, this thing's kind of deep for a cartoon. I really enjoyed that. But not only would they do cartoons on Saturday morning, there was a few live action shows. And you were nobody if you didn't watch Electro Woman and Dyna Girl, starring pre-Days of Our Lives, Deidre Hall. Now, this kind of stopped all this Hanna-Barbera stuff that was dominating TV. It was done by Sid and Marty Krofft. You may not know them, but they had a show called H.R. Pufnstuf. Now, it was only 16 episodes of this show. They were only 12 minutes long. They were reporters at this newspaper. And then when something would happen, they would be charged, and this bright light would come called the electric change. And they would run off and fight and be changed to these sequin clothes, which was kind of much for preteen boys. And they drove the electric car. And instead of the Batcave, they had the electric bass. And I'm getting electrified repeating all these words. It was a simple little show. Like I said, it was only 12 minutes, but boy, they ran that thing probably, seemed like to me, like 7, 8, 9 years. So I guess it was popular. And then later on, you had Shazam, or Captain Marvel. He just said Shazam, and he would change Captain Marvel. You could figure that all out. Billy Batson would be riding around in this Winnebago looking for villains and someone to fight, because that's what preteen boys do. They ride around in a Winnebago looking to start something. I remember, it was a simple little show here, but it was a comic book. Now, you got to remember, this is before all these comic book movies and all this other stuff. So it seemed really exciting to us, We enjoyed it, it went off, but, it was an interesting little show. It's called Shazam. And then sometimes they would team up with this other female character. She was called Isis. She was just basically a poor man's version of Wonder Woman. she would transform into an Egyptian goddess and deal with crises a mere mortal could not restore. Because when I'm in trouble and things are tough, I'm looking for an Egyptian princess. We watched it. Like I said, it came on kind of near the tail end of these cartoons, and then around noon, you knew all this was over with because what came on? It's a Soul Train, and if not that, then it'd be the American Bandstand with Dick Clark. And then you knew right then, hey, time to get the TV back to the adults. This is KDS Reviews. This is a kind of remembrance of some of the Saturday morning programming. And remember, KDS Reviews is seen every Wednesday and every Sunday. And throughout the week, we talk about the state of Hollywood as far as movie making is. If you like this type of content, then like, subscribe, and share. You remember a lot of these little Saturday morning cartoons? Why don't you mention them down below? This is KDS Reviews, and I'll see you in the next video.